It's a real pleasure to be here in Tallinn, and I really look forward to learning more about Estonia over the next couple of days. And this morning I've got some thoughts to share with you. They might be coherent in places, but not everywhere. I apologise for that. But that's because I think I'm developing some of the things that I'm thinking about. And also, these thoughts are mine, not the BBC's. Because the BBC is a very big and unwieldy organisation. It's approaching its 90th birthday. It has 7 TV channels, 1.5 of them not in English, has more than 40 radio stations, and that's before you start to count the World Service, so that's just in the UK. We have 95% of the UK population uses one of the BBC services every week. Though that take-up is lower amongst our minority ethnic audience, amongst younger people, and amongst the working class. And it's paid for by a licence fee, which amounts to a little bit more than Netflix. So, before I start, I just wanted to point out and respond, I guess, a little to what people have said about migration and diversity, and give you a kind of example. I really like this microphone. See this thing? It makes me feel like I'm Madonna, which is a good sign. But as a child, whenever I got a cut, someone would put a plaster on me and tell me that it was skin-coloured. But it wasn't my skin-coloured. So this would probably disappear on other people, but it doesn't disappear on me. And some of the things that we might assume are ordinary background things might have to change because our population is changing in Europe and beyond. So, after the best part of 20 years working on issues of racial justice, my career took a surprising turn. So I now work in media strategy at the BBC, rather than at Runnymede. And I was really proud of the work that we did at Runnymede, and you'll get to hear from the current director of Runnymede later on during this conference. But one of the early insights from doing the work with Runnymede was recognising that for those seeking social justice, it may be necessary to be right, but that's not sufficient in creating the change that you might like to see. Being heard is crucial, influencing public discourse is vital. That's why, at that time, we invested very heavily in communications tools, in packaging messages about racial justice in ways that appealed to various audiences and empowered others to make positive arguments for change in their local and professional environments. So a move from racial justice work to public service media was surprising for me, but not actually as much of a turn as you might expect, as many of the issues of citizen integration recur in developing public service media policy. I think we overlook citizens' media consumption at our peril, and after all, our public square is now online as much as it is in the centre of town. Increasing numbers of us will be in contact with hundreds of people this weekend and will not leave our homes. If we're thinking about inclusion where people live, then we have to concede that much of our lives are immersed in media. And that raises some questions then about what is the proper role of public service broadcasters and media in migrant integration and in promoting broader social cohesion. So, by way of preface, I need to acknowledge first that media representation matters, not just for those who are represented, but also so that others are able to learn and practice empathy, a crucially underplayed virtue in such antagonistic times. Some of you will recognise these pictures. These pictures are of the Oscar-winning film last year, Moonlight. And I cried when I saw Moonlight for the first time, not because the coming-of-age story was particularly new, or because this is the first black gay man like me I've ever seen portrayed on the screen. On reflection, my tears were a product of fatigue. This film allowed me to see that it was okay to be tired of all the effort that I'd put in over 40 years of my life, empathizing with people different to me, while most of them neither felt a similar pressure nor had the opportunities to do the same with people different to them. So I've learnt to empathise. I've felt suspense for the lives of white men from Bourne to Bond to Bueller, who were supposed to be my heroes. I found amusement in the romantic travails of Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. I've wheeled Grants, both Hugh and Carey, to get the girl. My favourite films include Singing in the Rain, as well as Blazing Saddles. I empathise, and I empathise hard. Otherwise, I'd get very little out of the mainstream media that I consume. And it takes effort. It matters which stories get told, and that they have the chance of being really listened to by others. And this is even more so for those who are marginalised, and about whom lies are so easily spread. Minorities, those without access to economic power, those who are strangers and newcomers, those for whom a national conversation so often means their rights being put under scrutiny. Access to public service media is not naturally equitable. Like all power, it is raced, it is gendered, it is classed. In the constant media revolution, it can be easy to lose sight of the persistent patterns of exclusion and marginalisation in the excitement of the latest new tech app or tech solution. Because there's been a revolution in media consumption patterns. I grew up with 4 TV channels. I remember renting videos from a shop along the high street. Now, Netflix alone accounts for 30% of TV viewing hours in the United States, and this is likely to increase. Increasing numbers of people no longer own a television. Immersive virtual reality is already here, and the tech is moving at pace. I suspect that most of you are carrying a machine in your pockets with processing power and connectivity greater than your workplaces had altogether a generation ago. The implications are legion. So what does this mean for the public sphere? The BBC and other major broadcasters for a long time felt as if they were operating in a Habermasian bourgeois public sphere. They would, like Habermas, compare their position to that of the 18th century London coffee shop, a space where the public meet to inform each other and engage in debate so that citizens can decide how he relates to the state. But as Nancy Fraser and others have pointed out, Habermas's formulation of the public sphere requires a space that transcends inequalities. And many in the mainstream media would like to argue that they do this. So the BBC will point to shifting British views on homelessness with the famous documentary Cathy Come Home, Channel 4 to attitudes on learning disability with Walter, or LGBT rights with Queer as Folk, and Channel 5 to creating greater empathy with their Gypsy Kids series, as evidence that they represent diverse voices. But in reality, it's unlikely that this public sphere has ever really operated in this way. And that kind of untenable nature of that position that there is this kind of neutral public sphere is why the debate in the UK about diversity of provision and diversity among personnel in public service media is such a significant one. So Fraser argues, instead of this kind of this neutral public sphere, for the existence of counterpublics rather than that single space. And she defines these in the following way. Counterpublics are parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses. For me, this is where we now are in broadcast media. A series of overlapping counterpublics operates while large broadcasters, designed for a different period, seek to re-establish their relevance and reassert a model of universality which is at best wishful and at worst a means of retaining power among a class elite. Fraser's analysis instead requires a pluralist public sphere, which means balancing views, paying particular attention to the marginalised, following the money, i.e. greater public scrutiny of public service media, and raises that uncomfortable spectre of greater state intervention to hold the frame. The days of 3 or 4 channel TV are over. Indeed, the days of TV and the channel are numbered. It's unsurprising that those who've been poorly served by the bourgeois public sphere vote with their feet and have started to create their own media which reflects their truths. The noble, aloof, objective public sphere is exposed as a mirage. The emperor has no clothes. The king is dead. Long live the king, perhaps. Individuals have always sought to use media creatively, and as the barriers fall to creating media content and to distributing it solely among discrete groups of people similar to us, our options for self-expression grow. So one of the outcomes of greater choice of content and means of receiving that content is the potential reduction in shared experiences, the end of what was called the water cooler moment at the more trivial level, but also a threat to a public sphere which is inclusive and diverse, and public debate that is informed by all who have a stake in it. The proliferation of media content, access and distribution may cause a significant splintering of media publics, and conversely have the impact of reinforcing the power of elites as small niche distributors and creators are collected by the big players. Facebook buys aggressively smaller broadcasters. And these big players can often operate outside of national borders and are busily subverting regulatory control in a similar way that they currently do to national tax systems. The decline in consumption and production of local news in the UK is a good example. So local newspapers were often late to new media, found competition for attention much more fierce, and then couldn't break into established filter bubbles. So given that kind of understanding that we're finding ourselves within these filter bubbles, creating our own medias and working in ways which are overlapping rather than in a kind of shared public space, a number of questions emerge. Firstly, what are we asking migrants to integrate into? Should they be seeking a place at the mainstream media table when mainstream media seems to be in decline? Who should they, and all of us, trust to deliver news impartially? What can Netflix tell them about their new neighbours, if anything? What can specialist platforms, and they're growing at pace, so specialist black platforms like Quaily TV or the black gay platform Slay, how do they move us beyond bonding social capital to some kind of bridging role? And given our public sphere our public square, is no longer physical, what happens to localism there? What happens to local government? What happens to city states? And as these new platforms become even more specialized, why would migrants bother to leave the platforms they're on for a confusing local version? How would we make our current media relevant to them? So there remains a role for media that operates in the public interest to reflect and capture changes in that expression. And that role is a powerful one, which is likely to become more rather than less significant as media sources and platforms proliferate. So the most direct way for a public service media organisation like the BBC to respond in this context is to have voices and experiences from right across society within the organisation. So learning from each other and collaborating to create relevant content. And this is why the BBC has set some really stretching targets for the diversity of its staff, with progress reported publicly by grade and by protected characteristic. It also takes its responsibility to the industry seriously, using its buying power to encourage greater diversity, creating media centres and hubs across the British nation and regions, and working alongside industry partners to build a diverse workforce of the future through an emphasis on apprenticeships, as well as the even larger ambition of supporting media and technology education. So last year, the BBC, with some partners, gave every 11-year-old in the UK a microbit to help them start to learn how to code. The second part of the response is to listen better. More people should get the opportunity to have their say on the content and feel on the content and feel that they can influence an organisation that's both responsive and accountable. And this includes migrants. So beyond the formal complaints process, and this is the accountability thing that I do for a living, beyond the formal complaints process, online personalization will provide so much better data on audience views. So we have initiatives like the BBC Three Playground, where young people get to make content and influence the content that we put out on BBC Three. BBC Children Stepping Out, where our staff who work in children's television go to school every term and work with children. BBC Scotland's The Social, or Radio 1's Youth Council bring audience insights right into to the decision makers and the commissioners. The day after the UK voted to leave the European Union, Gary Young wrote this in The Guardian. And the key line for me is, it became clear that for many of us, beyond our families, we didn't just disagree with the other side, we literally didn't know them. So while this conference and our discussions today are about migrant integration, it's clear that the issues we're discussing are much more fundamental ones about the potential for the success of plural modern democracies. We see in the UK a lighter version of the atomization that's been evident in US politics for the past couple of decades. And I'm not sure about the causative effects of this, but I think it's interesting to note that in the 1990s, the sitcom Friends, people know Friends? Friends? Everyone's seen Friends, of course, Rachel's hair, all that. But the sitcom Friends was regularly the most popular TV show, but only the most popular TV show amongst white Americans. It never made it into the top 10 most viewed programs among African Americans. So is Trump the result of a prolonged cultural distance and a related decline in empathy? So are we seeing in our politics a reflection of what's happened in our media? So what's been the BBC's response to this situation? So we've, I think, identified a couple of things that the BBC is particularly well placed to do. And one is in the creation of national moments, and secondly, the marshalling of a national conversation. So you can see, and this is from our plans for just this year, that in drama and entertainment, in sport and comedy, the language turns very much to these kind of, how do we create a national moment? How do we create national conversations? So interestingly, it's the German football team is a good example of the ways in which we use entertainment and broadcasting to bring people together. But being able to host a national conversation requires the ability to know and understand that nation, and also to know who's not being included. To be able to bring people together around shared concerns and to have them want to come back. Given that social distance may be responsible for driving harassment and abuse online, returning to the conversation is not guaranteed for those who are marginalized. So these are skills that are dependent, the skills of marshalling this national conversation, they're skills that are dependent on being alongside audiences, listening to audiences, but also crucially creating the kind of high quality, creative, and new content that's attractive to viewers and listeners. Media has changed, and the pace of change is predicted to get even faster. Can you believe that Facebook's not yet 15 years old? Right? When we talk about migrant integration, we very often focus on institutions like schools, hospitals, workplaces, civil society. And I very much welcome this conference's focus on media, and I'm looking forward to further discussions about how to make our inclusion strategies ready for the next step in what's becoming a constant media revolution. Thank you.